Alright, cool. Welcome to round 4, Sunway to be open. Without further ado, the motion that this House will allow campaign contributions from international actors. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to make it clear.
Okay, so 3 main questions. Firstly, who are the international actors? Secondly, how do international actors then affect national policy? And lastly, I'll explain to you why our model is justified. So let's understand the first question. Who are international actors? With all countries like China, Russia, US, France, UK, NGOs like say Transparency International, Oxfam, or even regional organizations like ASEAN, UN, AU, EU, and NATO. So we believe that any actors, insofar as they are external party away from the government, they can contribute to campaign donations. So very quickly, how do international actors affect national politics and why do they need money? We think the first reason is that politics is getting increasingly connected, for one, that companies or that countries are getting increasingly connected. Secondly, we need to understand that campaigning is a very expensive process. And the last reason that I'll talk to you about is that currently campaigning is very opaque, and that is why we need our policy to be in place. So let's understand the first issue on how countries are becoming increasingly connected. We think because of the process of globalization, economies are increasingly interdependent. But with free trade agreements and bloc and cluster bargaining, virtually every single economy is connected in some way or another. With further regionalization like that of EU, like that of ASEAN, we think all the countries are collectively becoming to be one entity with international mobility of labor, but followed by the EU. We think free movement of labor renders interests to be increasingly interconnected. That's why we believe everyone then has a stake in terms of national policies. And no one then stays on an island alone in this world anymore. We think that's the context. That is why we think the 21st century is so important to allow people to receive donations. Very quickly, why is it then important to be invested in politics? So thank you, sir. We think firstly, when you invest within national politics, you clarify your stake in it. The amount of money they contribute is corresponding to the amount of importance and how much you value this kind of investments. We think it's fundamentally really no different from that of lobby groups in the status quo, where NNCs themselves can endorse certain state interests, endorse certain politicians to further their own interests. But we think this is more important in this case because international actors bring about a different set of priorities that can beneficially impact the politics within a nation. We're talking about things like Obama's bill being blocked with regards to the Trans-Pacific Partnership because of lack of political support in its home ground, because the Senate and Congress do not trust that the Trans-Pacific Partnership bill is able to gain the benefits that's promised. We think the act of investment with international agents are able to back a politician for this campaigning to bring about true organic or true economic change. When they show support, we think that's the most powerful endorsement to empower politicians that so desperately need help, need political endorsement in terms of actions they need to take. We think Trans-Pacific Partnerships value at $600 billion is something the US can actively invest in, but they are afraid because of the setbacks in the status quo. But these international organizations, these international actors can clarify certain importance, certain elements, because these partnerships, including that or Trans-Pacific Partnership I've previously mentioned, as other things like Transatlantic Partnership, are valuable things that they can invest in, and they should be able to influence because these affect their own people as well. We think increasingly everyone has a stake in this. We think that's important. Before I move on, yes, sir.
Would you allow non-citizens of the nation to vote in elections?
Nation, no, this is fundamentally very different from sponsoring someone to represent interests versus giving him a direct stake in the interest. Nation, well, we are facilitating a process of representation, but that does not mean that we're directly giving them, the equal stake, because we represent the territorial interests still matter to some extent. Politicians still have to account to citizens' duty. They still must ensure citizens' welfare to some extent, but they do not have to do it to absolute one. They also have to care about other people who matter in this case as well. We are talking about how people are increasingly interconnected. We think this is quite different. More importantly, Asian, we think when international actors are able to support certain candidates, this also helps to combat corruption because under political dynasties, we think one of the biggest problems is cronyism. When people entrenched in power can continue to consolidate their own power because their family and friends all over a political network. When people in parliament, when you look at Aquino family, or say Indonesia, we see all these political dynasties entrenched the stranglehold of power, make it extremely difficult for politicians to get through because of politics intimidation because they are strangled by existing incumbent dynasties. That is why when international organizations endorse more liberal policies, more liberal parties that want to contest in these elections, we have a greater playing field because we equalize the current disadvantages they face. That is of economic resources. Because the ruling elites, say for Philippines, have benefited from the Dutch rule. The Dutch elites educated a certain group of political elites. Then they continue to stranglehold on power, they continue to hold the key economic industries, leaving the other political parties poor. In order to equalize this playing field, that's why we see that this political coalition is so important. This movement brings me on the reason, on why funding is so important. We think funding is essential to the democratic process because in order to reach out to the audience, you need a lot of money through media, through campaigning, through allowing your voice to be heard. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, for competitive media markets, like say 340 million people in the US, it can cost a lot. Easily, 2.5 billion is the cost incurred for presidential elections, for most recent presidential elections. Even the UK themselves paid 49 million in order to contest as members of parliament. We think in order to sponsor, in order to help democracies that are still being cut down by political dynasties, all the more imperative for the small parties that are already in need of funding in the first place. Many of them, according to a research by New York University, over 100 political parties campaigning for liberal ideals barely have 100,000 campaign fund to go begin with. We think the lack of the campaign funding, the lack of ability to reach our audience vastly cripples them if these people stuck in cronyism, in corruption, when political dynasties continue to strangle the people, continue to do things like vote catching and vote buying because they have the power to do so. And the opposition always disadvantaged because they don't have the economic resources that the incumbent have. We think this then brings me on my last issue on how allowing campaign donations allows for a more transparent process. We think currently the process of gaining political donations is very opaque. It's undisclosed. Some donors are Welsh students. It complicates the electoral process because it gives the incumbent unfair advantage. We don't know where they get funding, but we just know that somehow they do get money, and this is a problem because no one knows where the money really comes from. We think even for unannounced candidacy, when Hillary Clinton can just get $4 million out of nowhere, it's a little problematic because there's no transparency in funding, there's no transparency in democracy. I think democracy is still the people because it builds it on the ground that people cannot understand how the process works. It builds it in terms of knowledge and accountability. So for all these reasons, because we help further democracy, because we protect the people, we will receive funding from international actors.
All right, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his speech. Now to open the case for opposition, I'd like to invite the leader of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I asked in my POI if the government would allow international actors to vote in elections. The response was that, oh no, they're different. We believe in territorial integrity. However, he failed to realize that by putting more dollars, international dollars, into campaign elections, you are still influencing the outcome of elections through the vote of your dollars, even if you don't necessarily go to the poll. We think this is something that is bad, and we do not want it to continue. A couple of rebuttals before I go on to my section. We heard the last point coming from government is that we make it more opaque, the campaign contributions currently are very opaque, and we make it more transparent simply by allowing more dollars to come into the system from international actors. Never did we hear exactly how exactly the campaign would suddenly be more transparent, but we believe that even if you want to enact regulations to make the campaigns more transparent, you can do so without increasing the amount of funds flowing into it. By mandating that political campaigns publish their finances and make sure that we know where the money is coming from, we believe this transparency can be achieved, so we don't think there's a clash there. But on the other issue we talked about, presidential elections are expensive. We need help for younger democracies that are fighting against corruption to be able to fund their elections. Well, these are arguments for why the people should be able to have a transparent democracy. We cannot influence elections by curtailing the sovereignty of the people themselves. If the people have voted for incumbents, then they believe in those incumbents democratically elected are best for them. We believe that is the choice of the people themselves and should not be influenced by outside actors who will not be the main ones who are affected, by the decisions of these political leaders that the people do elect. On combating corruption as well, again, they say that they allow for a greater playing field of economic resources. If you really want a greater playing field of economic resources, we can mandate that campaign contributions be limited and be capped for each political party, for example. And that would be money only coming from within the country, from domestic actors who are directly affected by the outcomes of the elections themselves. And I'll talk a little bit more about why international actors are not as affected as he would have us claim. As far as the TPP and signing international agreements and globalization, we do believe that the world is in fact more globally connected and that decisions made in some countries do affect other countries. However, we don't believe that this necessitates or this allows for undue influence from international actors on the affairs of the people. If the United States as a whole, the citizens of the United States, do not want to sign the TPP and therefore vote for a candidate who says publicly, I will not sign the TPP, that is their prerogative, and it is not for you to influence the decision of the politician or the people themselves through advertising, which I'll talk about in my speech, in order to get the benefits that you want, even though the people believe that they will suffer in the end. Whether or not they're wrong is not material to this debate. It is the decision of the people to make their choices about how they want to be governed, the decisions they make for themselves, and they are the ones that must live with the consequences of those decisions. On to my points. First, what exactly is the role of politics? What is the role of money in politics? To continue with the example of the US, presidential elections are heavily influenced by the amount of campaign contributions that politicians are able to amass. More money is equal to more advertising dollars. This means you have a wider reach to citizens of your country, particularly in comparison to your opponent, who, if he is not able to raise as much in campaign contribution, is severely disadvantaged when he can't reach the same number of voters. Not just with regards to advertising, which is extremely negative and is targeted to the lowest common denominator of swing voters, because most voters who are already affiliated with parties are already designated. So the elections are decided by the swing voters. These swing voters are only now given information predominantly by the campaign that has more advertising dollars, as well as more dollars to finance door-to-door solicitations, for example, where you have volunteers knocking on the doors and telling citizens about this particular politician and the evils of his opponent. This type of undue influence is what occurs already in the system with money. Now, when you add the fact that international money is now being played in the system, what is the effect? Well, first, the best interest of the people is now being put at stake. It's compromised when you allow international influence over the decision to affect the country's new leader and its director. I'll take you in a minute. International actors will only contribute to candidates when they operate on the belief that they will have a greater return in the long run. Let's give an example. A businessman who contributes to a campaign of a presidential election for a candidate that says, I will lower tax rates on imports, for example, which the businessman is directly linked to. So now that politician will now influence his decision making. He will now have his stance based on decisions that affect the best outcome for his campaign contributor versus how it affects the citizens as a whole. This undue influence now changes the calculus. So now the best interest of the voter is not what's put at stake. It is now who is paying the most amount of money. So this may not be in the best interest of the people, yet the chances are increased now that voters will in fact vote in this way, even though it is against their interest, because this is the only information that they were given access to. Before I go on, go ahead.
So now Shell is holding Nigeria hostage. MNCs exerting undue influences within their country. Are you going to kick Nigeria or kick Shell out of Nigeria at the moment?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what undue influence you're talking about, but we don't think they should have a role in politics if that's what you mean. We think that, yes, MNCs should participate in the economy, and that, yes, you should consider the economic implications of whether having MNCs in your country is beneficial or not. But these are all decisions that should be made by the citizens of the country themselves, not influenced by international actors who will not be the ones affected in the long run. Let's say the economy goes into recession because you cut the rates on taxes and imports way too low. The businessman gets away scot-free, while the people are the ones who are left to suffer the recession as a result. This is not the outcome that we would like. The second argument is that now politicians are now more likely to decide their stance on issue based on who their biggest campaign donors are. Obviously, they will say that, oh no, we believe this is in the best interest of the country, but the influence still is there. This changes the calculus of the candidate or the politician deciding how to lean on issues of national importance. And if you so strongly believe that only the citizens of a country should be able to determine the fate of their country in economic, social, and political spheres, we believe that the same thing applies here. Just because they don't actually go to the polling station does not mean they don't influence the election. Voting with your dollars is still voting. It's wrong, and we do not stand for it. We are very proud to oppose this.
I elected the leader of opposition for his speech. That will be the case for the government. I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister there.
We think that side opposition is living in a utopia, but somehow, if we don't allow this in their paradigm, MNCs will not continue to contribute, but this is something we know is completely false. MNCs and other international actors are still contributing to the campaigns of essentially for democracies, such as my first speaker has pointed out, in Shell, in Nigeria, where they're exerting influence over the politics in these countries. And where even in the USA, other MNCs are also contributing, but very opaquely, to the campaign fund of certain candidates in which to support. We don't think that they are doing anything to stop this, but whereas on our side, we're making it transparent, we're making it apparent, we don't hide it, we don't conceal it, we fess up to what is actually happening, and therefore we actually make things better for both the people and the politicians. Why? And I'll go on to explain to this, but first, some rebuttals. Firstly, they tell us that that we cannot influence, that no international actor should be able to influence the outcome of the vote, and we are curtailing the sovereignty of the people, as we cannot influence them through advertising in this way. But this is not true, because we aren't influencing the outcome of the vote. People still have the one man, one vote theory, where they can vote for whichever party they want. And we agree, yes, because now we're targeting especially the swing voters who will be affected by advertising. But I think that because we allow international actors to contribute to the campaign funds, that these candidates and the countries will be able to get their message out better. That because international actors choose to support these candidates necessarily support the international actors' interest, and then therefore that's why we provide more information to the swing voter about what exactly the politician is standing for, exactly what the politician wants. We make it more transparent because already in that paradigm, international actors already contribute money to the campaign fees, those like itself of the politician. However, the thing is, the politician will still be able to represent the best interest of the voters. Their paradigm is completely false, because ultimately it is the voter who votes the politician in. The international actor merely contributes to the campaign fund. The politician still has to appeal to the voters, welfare, such as for public transport, education, things that concern the voter, in order to get a voter in the first place. And then therefore buffered by the campaign funds from the international actors. They think that no man is an island. We're going to tackle this idea from my first speaker, that no country right now lives alone. That every single country is incredibly connected to each other. That even domestic policies have impact on international policies, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the United States, which is being blocked because by the Senate. whereas it will bring much benefit to other industries and to the people themselves. We think that the undue influence the claim that undue influence will be exerted is completely untrue. It just has a mere clarifying effect on the stakes that international actors have already in the country. And the thing is, this is not unique. That every corporation does the same, any domestic corporation does the same in the form of lobby groups. Now we're merely making it more transparent. Yes, sir.
The reason why domestic companies are still allowed to make campaign contributions, although they are in fact limited and should be, is because they are more directly affected, because they are citizens and are directly affected by the economic situation of the country, more so than international actors, even though they may be affected indirectly in the long run.
Thank you, sir. So because but then the thing is, there are international actors are still affected by whatever happens in the domestic countries, such as international actors, such as NGOs, like Amnesty International, where they function on the basis of actually promoting more positive change worldwide. And therefore, when they actually are allowed to contribute to the fund of these of the campaign of politicians who support, let's say, Amnesty International's agenda, we think that this necessarily brings more positive change globally, internationally, and promote the NGO's agenda at the same time, which we don't think is a bad thing in the first place. Now, this is on to my substantive already on how we facilitate positive international change. Another thing is NGOs who give who provide, let's say, funds such as Transparency International, Oxfam, and also other international bodies such as the EU, like who provide funds. We think that there's necessarily a motive in funding these these politicians in campaigning, right? And they believe that the politicians support their agenda. And such in the case of EU, where we think that if we actually allow our policy to take place, they can officially fund Viktor Yushchenko in Ukraine in his campaign efforts. We think that this will necessarily benefit and help stabilize Ukraine in the long run, where Viktor Yushchenko is pro-EU but currently needs a lot of funds in campaigning. We think that this is sort of a carrot and stick approach that will allow the international bodies to take officially. We think that this provides more transparency to these NGOs, to the international organizations, and this targets their point of transparency, right? On how there are the means to be more transparent and combat corruption. No, we don't think so, because this is basically the only way they can't stop what's happening, and therefore we provide avenue for these funds to be more transparent. We give more legitimacy to the money that comes from international organizations. We make it more accountable, where we can track where exactly it comes from and what exactly it's doing. And besides, it's only for campaigning and not necessarily buying votes in whatever way. We think it completely is in line with the ideals of democracy. I think that it actually promotes the effect that the cohesiveness that everyone has a stake in the country, in even international actors as well, who can be more effective in their effort to change the world for the better. Because of globalization, because of interconnectivity, because of the free labor market, and working together has become even more important. It cannot be neglected that international actors do have a stake in the country in the first place, but they're not robots, as we have constantly clarified. That because of each country huge impact on each other, the domestic policies necessarily now have a global impact on the world at large. And therefore, in order for the world to become a better place, international actors have to be allowed to donate to the campaign fund of politicians.
Right, so let's thank the Deputy Prime Minister for a speech making the case for the off-elected by the
at the point where you have various influences by different currents, by different organizations from outside, which are not necessarily good, which not necessarily see for the good of the country, then comes the biggest probability of having politicians who will definitely mislead the country, will definitely not represent their voters as properly as the real politicians are supposed to do. Here it comes the probability of bad influence. Here it comes the probability of making not really good decisions, but really represent the interest of the citizens in itself. I have two things to talk to you in my speech. Firstly, I will talk to you on the effect of the influence on the politicians themselves. And secondly, I will talk to you about the harms of this policy that they are promoting. But before I go to that, I have a couple of rebuttals. Because I first wanted to talk about the globalization and how the world is going to be becoming a village, and you have to have all the globalization. But you don't think that the globalization has gone to the extent where sovereignty of the country is actually breached, where sovereignty and the influence in the country is going to that extent, where other parties from outside are supposed to have influence in the countries. Secondly, they wanted to talk about to cure the corruption and to cure the corruption in the country, and but they actually never proved to us on how they are going to cure the corruption and what's definitely the logic on that curing the corruption. Definitely not the case. And even if they want to talk about the curing the corruption, that's not the way. The corruption is supposed to be cured from within the country and not from the outside influences of the country. Thirdly, they want to talk the strongest point that they wanted to bring up the disadvantaged parties within the country, but we don't think that's the case, because even under your paradigm, you will still have the rich or the advantaged parties in those countries who are most likely to be recognized by other parties and to have more influence. I mean, to have more friends outside, to have bigger companies outside. So the people who will be influenced, the people who will have the parties backing them from outside, will be those parties who have been for so long advantaged, because they have created the strongest friends, they have created the strongest links with the parties outside the country. So the people who are likely to get those funds are those people who are advantaged at this stage. Basically, what will you create in that stage? You will create a proxy war where all the parties from outside will actually try to pursue their own interests. So they will fund and they will pour money in the country in order for them to gain people who will actually further on favor their own interests. They wanted to talk about the people. The voters will not now make the choices. They are the ones who will give actually the vote to the politicians. But we don't think that's the case, because we don't think it's an informed choice. When you have been so deeply affected by the campaign, by the heavily sponsored campaign from outside, and you have been you have been manipulated by the advertising and the heavy amount of advertising by those politicians who have been funded from outside. And we don't think that's a real informed choice, because the people who win will be the ones who have the strongest campaign, the ones who will have the strongest people to back them up. Yeah, basically they wanted to talk about the national companies. We still allow them to come up and actually fund their campaigns. But we think, and as in MPI has asked you, because they are actually directly affected by the decisions made by the politicians. That's why we allow them. To come and actually maybe sponsor the. But one thing that they will have actually to prove us. We allow the immigrants to vote in immigration law. This is a big question that actually is a burden on them to answer. But let me go to my substantive. First, I have to talk. I talk to you about the effect on the politicians, because we have to understand first the nature of sponsorship, the nature of you backing someone because if someone backs you up, they definitely must have a self-interest. No one will back you up. No one will come and give you money without them having any interest. Therefore, you getting the funds will come at the expense of you obeying catering to the needs of those people who actually are sponsoring you. Why is it wrong? Because it's wrong because at the point when you get the funds, then you are supposed to cater to the needs of the people who have sponsored you, to cater to the needs of the people who have poured money into your campaign. Therefore, when it comes to major decisions in the country, then you will not be able to cater to the needs of the citizens, but therefore you will have to cater to the needs and to the desires of those people who have funded you. Therefore, we think that's the case. For instance, if a company wants to invest in your country, and if that company brings more harm to your country than benefits, and that company has actually poured money into your campaign, you will definitely have to cater to to that company because that company has backed you up, and definitely you have to gather to their needs. Yes, sir.
So how is it okay for a local company to support a politician with a certain policy, and it's not okay for an international body to do the same?
Exactly, that's exactly the case, because we already established and we already told you, because that company is the one that is directly affected by the decisions made by the politicians, and yeah, therefore they have the right to sponsor, and they have a right to fund the politicians that they think are best for the country, and not outside, outside parties which are not directly affected by the politicians, because the outside parties are more likely to sponsor and to give money to the people who will cater to their needs rather than to the needs of the country in itself. But second of all, I will talk to you about the harms of having these politics. Sit down, please. Yeah, because at the point when you allow international companies to come up and pour money into different countries, then you will have strong companies, you will have strong organizations who will indeed pursue their own interests. But what happens when you have strong organizations? At that point, there will be a monopoly of power. They will be able to monopolize the power in the board. They will therefore control the board and pursue their self-own interest. Therefore, they will make decisions. They will make decisions that will definitely cater to their own interest and not to the specific country. Therefore, at this point, at the second level, at this point, the citizens are the ones who are directly affected by these decisions, because they are the ones who bear the consequences of politicians' decisions, right? Because we already told you that politicians will eventually care to the needs and to the desires of those people who have actually poured money into their campaigns. Therefore, in this case, the sovereignty of the country is definitely breached, and we don't think that's supposed to be the case. Even though if they want to talk about the globalization has not come to the point where we have to establish, when you have to abolish all the borders, we have to establish to demolish everything only for us to have a global world. We don't think that's the case. For the interest of the people, for the interest of good politicians to come into power, we believe that we shouldn't allow these organizations to sponsor these campaigns. Here.
So we find it very weird. The side proposition comes to us today and tells us it's not okay for an international NGO to give money to a politician for his campaign, but it's okay for an MNC to give money to this politician for his campaign. But at the end of the day, all of them are doing this for a reason. But for some strange reason, side proposition asserts to us that because MNC is based in this country, it's okay for them to push for politicians to support their own agenda. We don't think at the end of the day, side proposition is necessarily going to help the population, because they're going to be pushing for politicians and political figures that benefit them in a certain way. So three main issues for this debate. Firstly, on the idea of the policy. Secondly, is voting really affected by an NGO coming in to support a campaign of this politician? And thirdly, what really how will we affect this country's future? So on the idea of policy, so side proposition asserted to us that just because an MNC is based in this country and somehow they have a stake in this country and they should be allowed to vote, to give money to a politician that they want. We don't think it's necessarily in the best interest of what they've said. What they've said to us is that they want these people, they want for this country that the politicians listen to the people, and how this is a necessary good. But we don't think if you are allowing these lobby groups to continue pushing strong old politicians, all these cronies back into power, they're really going to make a change for the country. We think that there's a fundamental problem with doing so. I think that in cases where there are dynasties within countries, there is certain political families continuing to go into the parliament, they're going to continue this age or continue old traditions that might not work in current status quo. We don't think that we don't think that it's necessarily good for a country. I think that just because the international body wants to support a campaign within a country doesn't mean that this agenda is bad. Give you an example of how there are 400,000 Polish people in Germany and 100,000 Chinese in Russia. These countries, if these countries want to to pay for a politician and maybe lobby for the rights of these minority groups within other countries. We don't think it is a necessary bad that's happening to the country. I think that the reason that we allow immigrants to vote for immigration policy is that maybe, well, these immigrants have become citizens to these other countries, so they have the right to vote. We don't think that there's a necessary bad if we allow NGOs to do so. And we think that in many cases, these NGOs actually balance the playing fields for politicians. We want them. We don't think that limiting, as what a side proposition has told us in the first speaker, at the end of the day, is about the swing voters. Who has the better advertisement? Who has the better campaign to capture these people's votes? We think that in the case of side proposition, when we go continue allowing MNCs pump in millions and millions of dollars into these politicians and not really going to advocate for any change, we'll continue running policies, the age-old policies that might not work in the long run. I think it's necessarily bad. Which brings me on to the second idea of voting, but before that, yes.
What's your mechanism to ensure that the change that is going to happen in the country is positive?
Also, there is no, we don't think there's a necessary way to ensure whether this change is good or not. But we think that change in itself is a better thing than not having any change at all. Because there's no way to when at a pace with which society is developing in the current status quo, we think that change needs to happen within a country, and it cannot happen if we continue allowing like old politicians to continue going back into parliament. So on the idea of how voting is affected, we think that what side proposition, the problem side propositions paints is true, where richer groups have where older political groups have more supporters, more backing, therefore they're able to campaign better. What we want to do in side proposition's case is for the NGOs to give them money, so these other political groups are able to campaign better, advocate for more change. We think that in cases where we think that for another political group to rise up and challenge this current political group standing in place, it's a good change for society. We give you an example in Indonesia. We don't think this where dynasties have been standing for a long time and now they're currently winning because their policies aren't working and other groups are challenging them. We don't want a case where political groups are just going to stay in power for a long time. There's no proper change and there's no good change for the country itself. Yes, sir.
Would you allow immigrants to vote on immigration law?
But so these immigrants are citizens of the country. They're allowed to vote. If they are not, if they are citizens of the country and they're immigrants, they should be allowed to vote anyway because of their citizenship, right? I don't really understand your point. So, onto the third idea of the country's future. We think that we want to promote change and progress within countries. So we think that organic change, as like opposition likes to promote, might not happen very fast. And while it's happening, people are still suffering. People within these countries might not be feeling the change and causing them problems. What we think we want to do with that proposition is allow for NGOs and international bodies to come and invest within politicians, for these politicians to advocate for more change. We tell you that these people might not have agenda, they might have agenda. But what we're doing at the end of the day is promoting another political party to offer a contest to this current political party for them to make proper changes to their current systems if it's not working. We don't think that a proxy war will happen as what side opposition has suggested to us, because these politicians will still be running with their own political agenda. It's just that having the financial support of other international bodies. And what they've told us about corruption, we think that the problem of corruption is more so in their paradigm. But if you don't allow these people to take donations from international bodies, these people are still going to do it anyway, and this money cannot be accounted for. This causes a problem for the people. What we want to do is to make this a legal framework, so these politicians have to be accountable for the money they get, where they receive it, and who they receive it from, to be accountable to the people. So at the end of the day, we think that we promote positive change to society, start with the proposition.
All right, I think the government will play speech. Now, continue the case for York. Invite York to go ahead.
think that government is the one who's living the utopian world. Because they assume that this form of international actors are like always the individuals or party, which is very good and with very noble intention, that you eventually want to give all their money and all the support because you really want to see that nation grow. But that's a load of crap, essentially, right? Because the problem that we have is like even in like normal actors within the nation, there's always a motive and hidden agenda that eventually the reason why they sponsor this event, and especially when individuals receive their sponsor as obligation they need to fulfill. We believe those obligations to national actors are okay, but it's very much problematic if they're compelled to do what the international organization asks you to do. So essentially there's two issues I'm talking about. Number one, who should be allowed to participate in a national election process and why? And number two, the impacts of these international actors. Now firstly, on who should be allowed to participate in the national election. Because what they're trying to argue to us, essentially, the principal justification why should allow international actors to be involved is because of globalization. Heck, we don't even know what the hell they mean by globalization. And because everything is interrelated. If state A does something, state B will be affected, and state B will supposedly have a say on what you do. So there's a lot of rules for us to argue here. Number one, it's not sufficient just because something affects another person, you automatically are allowed to put that much influence on the national election. Number two, if that really is the issue, then the question, the POI from Hassan Desa was very much relevant. We allow immigrants, for example, right, an immigrant from Indonesia to go to Australia and then vote upon what are the immigration law. Because currently, Tony Abbott wants to restrict the access of immigration as such. So essentially, we're arguing to you that those laws could affect Indonesians, but we will allow the Indonesian to vote. Because by your logic, you should. And we also have a problem if they really think that right now there is globalization and because it affects some other people, you will allow them to that impact. So why do you then be inconsistent? Oh, right now we wouldn't allow them to vote because we still respect territory and such. Right? We believe those form of contribution as international organization from in those campaigns also influence individuals in a very large scale. There's also an undue influence, there's also a breach in territory that we wouldn't want these individuals to allow, right? We believe that's very much problematic. So we believe, ladies and gentlemen, will you then allow the standardization of economic laws and such, like compel other countries to make this form of trade, because that trade will be beneficial for both of us. We don't think that's something that you should allow. So at the end of this debate, they never have a principal justification of why we should allow these people to vote, right? And then they talk to you about this kind of different perspective. Well, the first question that we should ask, is this perspective necessarily good? They only say it's different, but they never tell you why this different perspective is good at all, right? So then we argue to you who should be allowed to vote. Who should be involved. Number one, your own citizens should be allowed to work in this process, but also only companies which are based on that country should allow access to contribute. Why? It's not only because they are affected, right? Because even if they have a motive, that motive is something which is justified and also that we would allow. Because they also have an intrinsic incentive to ensure that whatever they want to fight for is not only beneficial for them, it's also beneficial for that very nation. So if something happens to that nation, as a company which is based there, you are more affected in comparison to Shell suddenly in Malaysia. If something happens to Malaysia, Petronas is affected, not essentially Shell. So whatever benefit that they want might not be the benefit of the home state they essentially want to argue about. Before I go on, yes.
So it basically conveys the idea of representation versus determination of interest. Because we're not determining a vote for them, people can still choose. We are only advocating a plurality of choices.
Yes, we understand. Now let's go on to the second idea we have to fight of these people. Because essentially what they, as you also considered, right? Like all these campaigns are expensive as such. And you also consider there's a lot of individuals where these campaigns are targeted by individuals who are swing voters. So essentially, you also agree that this form of companies eventually can influence a lot of individuals to vote on that policy. So the problem that we have is number one, is that this, and you read that number one, essentially what happens now is that individuals or the person who they contribute, for example, this or a political candidate are very much compelled to do things which are in the benefit of the companies or organization that we have. So later on, if they try to do something which should be different, they say no. If you do something which is not in our benefit, we will not later on support your campaign anymore. We'll support your opponent later on, putting these individuals into a situation where they're threatened, and we don't think it's good. For example, they also can influence these individuals, like reduction amount of tax for these companies and such, which might not be that beneficial for that nation, but very much beneficial for that company, and we don't think it's good. But even if it is, I mean, they tell you that this is very good to combat corruption and the dynasty. But the problem that we have, it does not make sense. If you want to talk about Indonesian, right, it's more logical if you allow this organization to come in and contribute, they'll contribute to the current leaders. Because it's more logical for them to also still win, because those dynasties are still there and still influence. So the problem that we have later on is that dynasty is further empowered within that situation. But even if right now the other candidate, they support other candidates which does not have sufficient funding, but those other candidates will then accept your contribution because of desperation, because of lack of funds. And if that is the situation, so this is when individuals will be the prey of this international organization, and later on they are compelled to do many things which might not be that beneficial, but they will still do it because they want to be in power, and that is very much problematic, ladies and gentlemen. Then they try to talk to you about, oh, this is better for this country because you have Trans-Pacific partnership and such. Number one, if they are the one who supports you, you are compelled to follow them, assuming are compelled to follow them. What if later on the citizen then agreed upon that we shouldn't sign this form of treaty, and we don't think it's easy for you to back up? But even if it is, those form of Trans-Pacific Pact or whatsoever can already happen even without them coming in and also influencing those individuals. So ladies and what basically I argue to you is that whatever they are doing is an undue influence within that particular country. You will not represent the will of people. You will not give any form of benefits to the political leader, and you will not make things better. What you're doing is just a form of bullying from the international scale. So that we're very proud to do. Thank you.
Cool. I'd like to thank the opposition for the speech. Now, close the case for the op. Everybody off the time right there.
Speaker, the reason why side government loses this debate is because they fail to differentiate for us exactly where the sovereignty of a nation ends and the effects that happen on international actors begins, thereby allowing them to have influence on the political outcomes of a nation. We asked them in several POIs, how far are they willing to go? Will they allow these international actors to vote? If they are so entrenched in the global economy, and if they are so directly affected by these countries, then why will you not just come out and say that they deserve a vote and they deserve to affect the outcome of the election? And the reason why they're afraid to say this is because they know that the people will not stand for it, that the people deserve sovereignty, and that they deserve to have their own uninhibited choices and decisions made without influence from outside actors who are not as directly affected by them and who do not face the same consequences of the decisions, whether or not they are good or bad. We're going to give you the comparative here on what we told you in this debate. We told you from side opposition that the international influence of businesses, for example, will far outweigh any potential good benefits they may get from NGOs or organizations that are goodwill in nature, that seek to benefit the people. While these organizations do exist and perhaps they may contribute towards beneficial outcomes, we do think that this opening that you allow for international actors to now come, all of them, to completely participate in, you will have an influx of so many international businesses and people driven by the profit motive, not by goodwill and good intentions for the nation in which they are now participating, and now that will have undue influence on how the outcome of the election comes and it affects the politicians themselves. We never heard any response on those issues. We never heard any response on the corruption that happens to politicians when they are now affected by these international money coming in. Because we did say that politicians are now going to be beholden to those people who contributed to them the most. Even after they are elected, they will still be forced to concede to the demands of their contributors because they can now turn around and be threatened because the international businesses, for example, will say, if you don't pass this law that allows me to get away with not providing health care, then I will contribute to your opponent in your next election. None of that was engaged with by side government, and that's another reason why they lose this debate. But on their strongest, perhaps, point that they brought forth in this debate, on developed countries versus countries that are laden with corruption, we gave you the comparative. Developed countries will have an undue influence over their elections, and we explained to you in detail why advertising and campaign contribution dollars have an undue effect on swing voters who do in fact decide the outcome of the election. Even though there may be other avenues of information, they will be unduly bombarded with only one side, which will influence their decision. But on corrupt countries, their policy will actually not be affected, even in their best case scenario. Why is this so? It's because these dynasties that are so completely entrenched in their system will already have connections to the outside world, international businesses. These connections will favor them when it comes to bringing in money for the elections. So when you allow now international contributions, would it not make sense that those already in power, that already have these connections, would be even more heavily funded than whatever opposition you are trying to support? This influence may even sway voters who say we don't want international influence over our elections and will vote against those candidates that accept those kind of contributions. At the end of the day, voter sovereignty and decision making is paramount. They didn't allow for immigrants to vote on issues that affect them, even though they are affected by perhaps more so than these businesses that they're talking about. And even though they're not, because specifically they are not citizens of the country, that undue influence is something that even they implicitly agree to. That is why we take the debate. We are very proud to oppose.
Right, like the opposite slide for the speech. Now the first debate for Cup and the debate as well, like the side Cup reply. Yeah.
So by the end of the debate, both sides acknowledge that until the influence exists, one side can bombard, and the vote will just continue like that. Because, ladies and gentlemen, they fundamentally assume two issues. Firstly, on the issue of voting, that when you represent issues, when you influence issues, you necessarily determine how issues are done. We even agree that the vote is sovereign. That is why we never take it to them, take it away from them. That is why we're not according people additional votes. Because we see that, yes, surely within a territory, you can be acknowledged some form of sovereignty. Just that we are only representing a greater plurality of interest. If voters don't like it, they can surely not vote for it. We don't see a tension there. Within side opposition, side opposition is fundamentally misunderstood the case by claiming that we disrespect sovereignty because we still allow it in the first place. We don't think that we completed that issue. We think that completely completed the issue between representation and determination. That is why it's very, very problematic. So, ladies and gentlemen, also ask the question, housekeeping issue before we move on to main issues. Why not make it transparent? Well, people have underground transactions in the status quo. So when we openly accept, that is when it can be truly transparent to show how we are support. Where does support come from? We think that's when our system is relatively more transparent. We think it has allowed a better system on the regard. So two main issues in today's debate. Firstly, are we alone or connected? Secondly, does help or hurt the people? So side the opposition assume a rather simplistic case saying that we are absolutely territorial bound. That within territory, only locals can vote, only local companies can vote because they can, because they are affected the most. But really, we really painted a scenario of how increasingly you find different MNCs in different countries. The whole territorial landscape has changed. We see Polish immigrants, as mentioned by my second speaker, within Germany. When you see Chinese workers inside Russia, the whole landscape is changing. We think that it's important to understand the connection that we share. But more importantly, they assume that every single voter will continue to somehow vote for the crony, corrupt people. We think it's weird because we also understood, we already clarified the debate, there was what NGO, Oxfam, as well as other organizations like liberal democracies, like US, who are champions of rights, right? From onset, that's why we think these other parties can be facilitated, other parties can be sponsored, rather than calling from people that are already established in my Prime Minister's speech. We think that we represented our case fundamentally. On the first issue of whether we're connected or alone, we think we've painted a more realistic characterization of how countries work and how countries interact with each other in the world today. So moving on quickly to the next issue of whether does it help or hurt people. Winning side opposition has assumed that we will always hurt people because the strongest people will naturally be back. But we don't think there's a logical conclusion there, right? Because insofar as their interests can be represented, then the donors will donate to whoever they want. That is why within all three speakers, we really established this rather clearly. Other people who believe in democracies, believe in whatever values, go for it. That is where a plurality of choices happen. That is when voter sovereignty can be respected. We think on our side of the house, we better allow it for people to decide. We better allow for people to help themselves. Because ultimately, the fundamental mischaracterization to so-called ethics that they assume we determine the nation's affairs just because we sponsor campaigns. We think this is never evident. This is never the case. We think this only assumes options whereby voters in the end still get to choose. Ultimately, it's really an issue of probabilistic. It's a probabilistic issue. How best can you help these people when people are already held hostage currently? Will it be worse on the comparative? We say, well, people will suffer. But if there's a chance where people can be saved, where people can have a better fighting chance, where playing field can be equalized, we think our policy has a greater probabilistic value in allowing for a better outcome. On comparative, we think at least our policy offers hope. They give us nothing.
Alright, I think the government replied to his speech, debate, cross clause, shake hands. Quick reminder, this is actually not a silent round, so we all that.
Really?
So position will be announced. Second announcement, break announcements will be made. So after this, after I give the decision later, you guys go straight back to the hall. Sure. Right, so
You don't like it, it's not silent, right?
thanks for timing.